Welcome everybody to our second webinar, and we appreciate that you've taken the time to join us today. As we mentioned, these will be recorded, and if you have to step out or leave early, there will be an opportunity for you to view it at a later date fully. I'm Kathleen Mattheos, and I join you from Treaty 1 territory, University of Manitoba, where the campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We all come from different territories and unceded lands, and we all are very appreciative of the opportunity to work, live, and play on those lands. Today, we really have a treat in that we're joined by Susan Barker, who spent 2 terms as the Vice Provost in Student Affairs at University of Calgary, and she's currently on academic leave, joining us from Somerset, England, where she's doing research on re-engaging students in the post-coronial world. And I think she's got some very interesting findings. Those of you who were in our other programs would have had an opportunity to meet Susan. This is an expanded presentation based on further research. So what we will do is it'll take her about 40 to 45 minutes to do her presentation. And please put comments, questions, discussion into the chat or questions into the Q&A. Both of those should be visible for you as participants. And we will curate these so that we can have an opportunity to have not only questions, but your comments and discussions and some techniques that you are using to re-engage students as we move back into a somewhat new but very different normal. So I'll turn it over to you, Susan, and if you have any issues with technology or you find that you're unable to hear, please pop something in the chat so that we can address it from our end. Thank you, and over to you, Susan.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are joining from, and it's very nice to be able to join you in this webinar. Apologies that I have the camera off. I have a bandwidth issue, and we're just trying to ensure that we keep the audio as clear as possible. As Kathleen said, I am joining you from the UK, where I'm on academic leave. I really don't miss the very cold Canadian winters, but I do miss those really sunny times after a snowstorm, and I do miss the warm Canadian people. So welcome everybody. My academic leave, as Kathleen said, is a great opportunity for me to spend some time reflecting, consolidating the work that I've done, and just a great luxury to read, reflect, write, and share, and sharing a little bit of that with you today. So the presentation title here is Engaging Students in the Post-Coronial Institution, Student Centricity and Student Partnership Models. And I am going to focus on mostly outside of the classroom rather than on partnerships and teaching and learning. And the reading I've engaged with to date is pretty, there's pretty overwhelming consistency. This is reading from right around the world. And that consistency is that we are in a real significant crisis, or indeed crises, compounded by COVID, but really that we were already in a crisis before the pandemic hit. And the consensus is that if higher education is going to survive, institutions really need to start focusing more on students. And that's what we'll look at today. I know right across Canada, institutions are at various stages of responses to COVID and focusing on students. Some fantastic initiatives going on. Indeed, I just read about one this morning at the University of Alberta. And it is important, really nice to see, and important for us to learn from each other, use ideas, adapt to our own institutions. So we'll have some time at the end to share too. So next slide, please. So the overview of the presentation is to think about student centricity. Again, this is a newish term that's been used as a framework for the future direction of post-secondary education. We often talk about our university community. I think the use of community is quite interesting because it suggests a collegiate working together. But it is clear that we're really not in this together. Students have been differentially disadvantaged, and inequities have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So the use of the word community is wearing a little thin for students. So the student centricity, I think, is a bit of a better term. And then we can see in the overview that there is a progression here in that student consultation is probably a first step as we move to students as partners in decision making. Next slide, please. So here's some of the stuff that's being written about in the literature at the moment. We are coming out of a crisis. I sincerely hope that all the evidence suggests we are. The literature is full of descriptions of the current situation, all full of superlatives. It's almost like the climate change rhetoric. Indeed, some of the descriptions, the weather analogy has taken over. But the terminology here, COVID-19 has been the biggest disruptor higher education's ever seen. The World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF called the COVID pandemic the worst education crisis on record. The maelstrom, tornado, hurricane crises, all of it highlights the incredibly challenging times we're in. And COVID, yes, pushed us further, but I think we do need to recognize that we were already in turmoil before the pandemic. It comes on top of decolonization, reconciliation, systemic racism, sexual violence. It is indeed a confluence of storms. Really not just the pandemic, it just got piled on top. So a lot of stuff we need to figure out. And in fact, before the pandemic, we were doing some great work, I believe, in responding to those challenges I mentioned. The hyperbole is widespread, and I think the reason why this type of communication is being used is to really emphasize the crisis we're in, but also that there is an urgent need for us to respond. And the urgency is important, but we also need to think about how we respond. So a couple of silver linings. So the pandemic actually, I think, has been helpful in some ways. I know it's hard to believe that, but the silver linings that came out of the pandemic, we can respond quickly if we need to. Oh my goodness, many institutions just were able to get new initiatives off the ground really quickly. Even Zoom, getting Zoom into an institution happened so quickly for many of us. Wide acceptance of blended and online teaching and learning and service position, that became again, a survival really for us during the pandemic. And before the pandemic, there was great resistance to providing services online, but we did it and students liked it. Well, they liked the choice, and I think having a blended option now is a really helpful way forward. Another silver lining was receptiveness to a community approach. I personally met and worked with people I had never seen before in my 10 years at UCalgary, and we all work together. And then finally, the silver lining that we actually do need to focus on students as we move forward. And to some extent, we can't control the students, but we can control their experience, and using student-centric models is absolutely essential if we're going to survive this maelstrom. And the consensus that we're in a crisis and the impacts of the crisis, I think, are pretty overwhelming. Students, what they're saying in many surveys that you can pick up on, and some of them are in the references on this slide presentation. Students are turning their back on higher education. The cost, it's not value for money. Employers are now also turning their back, looking for more skills and training. So all the research suggests that we need student-centered models to move forwards. Now, what does a student-centered model, student centricity model look like? Well, what it does is the environments, the policies, the processes are all designed in a way to promote access rather than create barriers. They need to foster engagement of students and to remove obstacles. And it puts the students and their needs at the heart of the decision making. And I think a fundamental challenge of where we are now is that students' needs and expectations have shifted dramatically in the pandemic. The pandemic absolutely accelerated that, but institutions have not transformed to meet them. Even in the pandemic, we had some shifts, which we'll look at in a moment, but lots of data worldwide. Canada's not exceptional in this instance, but how deeply unhappy students are. So next slide, please. So so this is what I've just talked about here, the consensus on the way forward, student-centric models, and some of the consensus on actually, what students were experiencing. So next slide, please. So the case for student centricity, we wouldn't be a university if it not for our students. So what role do students play in creating these student-centric models? Well, I think it's absolutely critical that we involve them in the way forward, in the revisions of policies, practices, and structures. And really, when we look at what we have now, they were all designed at a different time and could be considered as legacy. So many of our institutional practices perhaps are not fully aligned with today's students' needs or expectations of students. And these are sort of quite dangerous situations for us to be in. I think the Deloitte survey of Canadian post-secondary, so very specific to Canada, it's a pretty small sample, but it reveals that more than 1 in 3 students don't think they're getting good value for money. They don't think the students sufficiently focused on their needs, and that their experience really aligns with what their expectations are and how they can be successful. Next slide, please. So a question then here, just to think about, we don't have time to go into a full discussion on this, but for you to just be thinking about at every stage of a student life cycle, what students actually need. There's 3 questions here. Can a final exam schedule be student-centric? Can an institutional course schedule be student-centric? And can the institutional calendar be student-centric? And just as you're sort of thinking about that, I do want to digress just for a little story. Some of you may have heard this before, but an ex-colleague of mine who's since passed away, sadly, Sir Ken Robinson, who's widely known for his work on creativity, asked a question of his TED Talk audience, and he had many TED Talks. He asked them, how many people are wearing a wristwatch? Not a smartwatch, just a wristwatch. And he then asked the question, how many of you are under 25? And what do you think the correlation was between people who wear a regular wristwatch and their age? And, it's sort of a what's in your pocket question, because I'm going to tell you the answer here, that the correlation was it was mostly older people who wore classic wristwatches. And under 25s, the majority weren't wearing a wristwatch. And the reason is, of course, that the younger generation have grown up with time all around them on various devices. And therefore, the wristwatch doesn't really have any functional need. Pretty redundant apart from fashion statement. And so Ken asked his daughter, why don't young people wear wristwatches anymore. And she said, well, why would anybody want a unifunctional device? And he said to her, well, it does tell the date as well, sort of rather cynically. So, you know, I think just thinking about that wristwatch, it has become redundant to many people, which is actually shocking for us older folks who, you know, it was absolutely essential part of our lives. And nowadays, those that don't have access to advanced technology, where there's an assumption that you have it, are really differentially disadvantaged. So my point here is that we've developed over the years incredibly valuable items that perhaps no longer have currency for the vast majority of the population. And thinking in post-secondary, and maybe an analogy of the wristwatch with one of the items here on the slide is, you know, trying to improve the wristwatch when really we should be thinking about what role do these play in current post-secondary education. And the calendar here is an interesting beast. Coming from England, you know, I was really puzzled about the institutional calendar as really the most revered publication in post-secondary, I think. You know, you go into people's offices and there were, you know, 20 years worth of calendars on the shelves. And the shift to moving the calendar online was painful. People did not want it. They wanted to keep the calendar as it was. Even though we had really solid arguments for moving it online, the accessibility in terms of print size, sustainability of all that paper. But again, it's an example of how slow it was to actually change practices. And most institutions phased the move online in over time. When one institution went fully online, everybody followed it. Follow me leadership, which is a great example. And it was a painful process. It highlighted the problems of change management in higher education, but it also, you know, makes us think about, well, you know, what is the role of the calendar? Could we ever get rid of it? I mean, this is a pretty controversial statement. Can it ever be student-centric? Because the final exam schedule, the institutional score schedule, and the calendar were all developed. They all came about with regard to institutional needs and needs of faculty. So I think, you know, trying to tinker with things, and again, very controversial, some of these things, is maybe not the best way for us to move forwards. We need to make possibly some very radical changes to our institutions to become fully student-centric. Has the death knell for the calendar begun to toll? I think perhaps. We have massive duplication of information with web-based information. Students even make their own shadow systems, regulations, many of them now in policies. Lot of duplication, triplication, as I say, in faculties, online student centers. The institutional schedule is based on room utilization. As we move to more flexible delivery, new creative ways to access courses, a revolution in pedagogy will change this. And then the final exam schedule is really tied by size of rooms and common exams. However, do we really need final exams? And a revolution in assessment will probably change this too. The final exams were radically reduced in COVID, but it made people think about what do we actually need and what should we be doing. So the key message here is don't waste time tinkering with the design of watches, you know, go bold. But going bold will take time. And in the meantime, I think if we are tinkering with some of these, we do need to communicate those student-centric decisions to our students to demonstrate what we're doing to help them. So for example, with the final exam schedule, we need to share with them how we've reduced the number of back-to-back exams and so on. Next slide, please. So I think if we, yeah, so that just sort of re-emphasizes what I said, you know, we need to be bold, courageous, put students at the center. Next slide, please. So during COVID, we did quite a bit of tinkering around the edge, and we made emergency changes to policies and practices. Again, like you to think about what changes did you make, did your institution make? What do you think is important to keep, if any, and which ones will you not go back to? We'll try and pick this up at the end, but this is important for us to think about, because many of the changes that we did in COVID, in the pandemic, these emergency changes, were done with students' best interests in mind. So the question here would be, why do we need a crisis to be able to make decisions in students' best interests? So next slide, please. I've highlighted a few of these seem to be very common interventions that were made during COVID. The removal for requirement for medical notes. Yeah, we didn't want folks going into medical practitioners to get a medical note. Extension of add-drop deadlines, fee refunds when services were not being used, they weren't on campus, so why would you ask them to pay for gym, athletics? Uncoupling of fees, many fees are coupled together. Students for many, many years have said they don't like this. You know, is that something we certainly did in COVID? Should we be thinking about this a long time? Started to provide services online, including counseling. You know, yeah, it was fantastic that we were able to offer that to students. There were restrictions in international mobility, cancelled final exams. We had laptop loans, even router loans as well, and helped provide students with the things that they needed to be successful. So yeah, what should we do now then? You know, we did this in COVID. Should we be extending these and keeping them long term? I think the key thing is for us not to waste a good disaster, as the phrase goes. And you know, we got some traction from COVID. We got the momentum. Which ones should we keep? I would strongly recommend to people to really think about a couple of these. I think the medical note statutory declaration is one that stands out for me. And we have seen a couple of institutions already drop these permanently moving forwards. I think that's something that deserves close attention. Another one is availability of recorded lectures, universal design for learning. Students have just said in COVID, it was so helpful to have these recorded lectures, and very controversial because students love it and a lot of faculty don't like it. But there's a lot of advocacy in many provinces for more widespread implementation of universal design for learning. When recorded lectures are done for students with disabilities, then making it available for all students can help the wider population. And then finally, disaggregation of fees. I think this needs to be looked at, and I think it will come eventually, but it may take some time to do that. So next slide, please. So other focus factors from COVID, two significant factors. I think students now have a higher profile as consumers and drivers of institutional change, and more significant awareness of the role of mental health and well-being for student success. You know, unfortunately, we don't have time to think about that in this webinar, but it is really, really important. And again, lots of great initiatives going on. So how do we move forwards then? We've seen the challenges, we've seen the tinkering, we've done, you know, consensus for some bold decision making and student centricity. So on to next slide, please. So just as we get going into this, I want to think about the role of students as consumers or as partners. Again, a lot of literature talking about student preferences as consumers. What students want. Students want to enroll in schools with robust digital capabilities, customized experience, skills development, work integrated learning, lifelong relationship, and so on. And all of that is described in a consumer client model. This is what students want, what they expect. Now, viewing the student as a consumer in post-secondary has many challenges. And the challenges are that contracts entered into in this consumer client model, the student pays their fees and the institution has a duty to provide this education to the standard. If it falls short, there's complaints. And we saw a lot of that in COVID, that students did not believe they were getting value for money with the shift to online and recorded lectures and so on. But if we look at students as partners, the implications are really substantial and deep, because the student as a partner is an active member of an institution in which they share a strong sense of allegiance and commitment. And I think we need to think about where we want to be in these models. The consumer client model, I think, helps us with some strategic decision making, but the students as partner really needs to be a major area of focus. Next slide, please. So again, just to reiterate, it is a fundamental essence of higher education. What are we actually here for? Do we want detached external service users, or do we want involved collaborative internal members of our community? What are the implications of focusing on one rather than the other? And of course, the partner model really benefits the students' education, developing critical skills and citizenry and citizenship and so on. I just put a note at the bottom that the European Students' Union, they've put some great materials out, long widespread use of partnership models, and they firmly reject the notion of students as a consumer. And there's some really good arguments for why that's the case. Next slide, please. Now, the students as partner model is gaining increasing traction. You will see a lot of institutions now having web pages where this is right up in front. I'm going to share a couple of examples in just a moment. Now, up until now, I would say it is mostly focused on teaching and learning. So students as partners in pedagogical partnership models. And it's great that in Canada, we have some very strong leadership through McMaster University. They have a students as partners program. They actually have a journal, an open access journal. There's some fantastic things in there. I've been reading a lot out of that journal. I've really enjoyed it. And one of the interesting things is that, you know, it's certainly in decision making, it is a very emergent field, and there's lots of ways of conceptualizing this. But the definition here by Cook, Souther, Bovell, and Felton is becoming pretty seminal in students as partners are a collaborative reciprocal process. All participants have the opportunity to contribute equally, not necessarily in the same way, to curricular, pedagogical, decision-making, implementation, investigation, or analysis. So it's really very all-encompassing, and I think you're going to see that definition used quite a lot more in the future. Next slide, please. Moving to the European Union definition of partnership, very reflective of the previous definition, thinking about joint decisions, two different bodies, obviously students and the university working together, and going beyond consultation. So I think this is what we need to really think about, is how we extend consultation into partnership, because most consultation really is not a full partnership. So partnership students can help identify. They can develop their own initiatives and invite faculty to come in to help. But a true partnership means that neither party acts unilaterally. Now, at this point, I think I do want to just again highlight that we need to think about who's flying the plane here. Because again, that will come up, the analogy of an institution as being a plane, and you've got passengers and the pilots on board. Maybe an analogy of the administration being the pilots and the students being the passengers. You wouldn't expect the passengers to give advice on flying the plane. So I think we need to really think about that analogy, as there's always going to be that power differential, that experience, that education, but we need to get over that to think about what role partnership can play within our institutions. Next slide, please. So here are the two examples that I've chosen. I haven't chosen Canadian ones. I've chosen one from the UK, which is on the left here, Plymouth University. It is readable. Well, hopefully you can see it actually currently, but obviously afterwards you can spend some time looking at it. But what Plymouth have done is to actually set up, it's more of a Bill of Rights or a charter. It's our commitment to you, your commitment to us, and it talks about teaching and learning, quality, sustainability, health, safety, services and facilities, and so on. And but to me, and everybody's on this journey. So again, this is not a criticism of Plymouth University, because it's a great step towards developing these partnership models. But even the photograph is really just of students. It's not a photograph of the partnership. But some great work to start with on working with students to develop this. As I say, it is like a charter. The CHERD model in the bottom right here, CHERD in Australia. Australia is, again, some fantastic literature on student partner models, is showing the continuum. And it is more conceptual, no right or wrong. It's all part of that journey. But thinking about the level of power, consultation, participation, both on the left-hand side with staff, faculty, and on the right side with students. So I think, I really like this continuum partnership model as a way of institutions really thinking about initiatives that they can get going pretty quickly. So hopefully you'll spend some time following up, thinking about what other institutions are doing with these partner models. Next slide, please. So understanding your students, and we talked a little bit there about consultation being an early part of partnership. And again, a lot of the literature is saying that, we really need to understand our students. And one way is to understand the data that we have. So institutional data, survey data, I think is often underutilized. We have National College Health Assessment, National Survey Student Engagement, Canadian University Student Survey, and so on. And every single piece of data in those surveys tells us something. And I think we can do a lot more with data. It's an entry point in the student partnership continuum. I think we do need to make public the outcomes, the actions. I think we need to encourage students in reviewing the data from these surveys, interpreting data, setting goals, and a lot of institutions actually do this already. So again, I'm not going to the default that institutions are not doing this, but I do think we can do more. I know at Calgary, we had so much data, but we really didn't use it effectively. Next slide, please. Student consultation, an entry point to student partnerships, needs to be purposely planned and recorded. when we go look across media reports at students walking out on consultations or walking out protesting on obviously tuition increases, food insecurity, sexual violence as policies, you know, to think about how might student consultation and collaborative approaches ameliorate these situations, sorry. I think, you know, consultation would have occurred, maybe not collaborative approaches. You know, our tuition increases are a difficult one. Are students ever going to agree on tuition increases? But collaborative and deeply consultative approaches may help students understand the hard decisions institutions have to make. They may not like the decisions, but they will probably understand them much better. Next slide, please. Now this model, I've got two examples here, one from Australia, one from Alberta. This one is a great toolkit. It's a matrix. It helps us think about that progression from consultation, informing, consulting, involving, partner, and control. And the reason I like this one is the style, you know, really helps you see what sort of questions we can ask and how we can approach students. So informing students is a type of consultation. Sometimes we don't have any choice, particularly in COVID, when we had directions from public health agencies and we had to, you know, introduce them into our own institutions. But we could at least talk to our student associations and say, you know, well, look, this is what's happening. This is the decision we need to make. And then in other aspects we can have more detailed conversations. I'm just seeing we've got a question from Kathleen here, and we've got a few moments left. We will try and stop in a little while for some questions. I've just got a few more slides to run through, and then we'll have some time for questions. So next slide, please. So this is a student partnership staircase. I'll run quickly over this. Again, it just shows that progression from an information provider, student completing surveys, right up to being a partner in the role. Again, it follows that matrix of the previous slide. And then the next slide is from the University of Alberta. So next slide, please. This is a fantastic handbook, and actually it shows, you know, 2015, boy, were they way ahead of the game here in terms of a real toolkit for institutions to use. It uses the same model. In fact, all the institutions that I've looked at are using very similar models, which come from a seminal paper from the 1960s, which look at public engagement, getting citizens to be engaged in various activities. So I encourage you to look at that that handbook from the U of A. It's really exceptional in my perspectives. Next slide, please. Again, I'm just going to go a little quicker here. Student consultation plan, absolutely critical. This is where we really need to up our game. We need to document, we need to have somebody facilitate, manage it. We need to just ensure we're systematic with regard to student consultation, including action points that come out of it. And again, a student consultation plan can be highly collaborative with students, but this is, again, I think where we can probably do some valuable work. Next slide, please. And of course, Indigenous consultation needs it's a very important angle for us to take, and we need to honor protocols, obviously engage elders and find that ethical space between Indigenous and Western world views, and much value can come from that Indigenous consultation. Next slide, please. Forever Universities, again, this is a new idea that's come out recently. A Forever University is one that's going to survive COVID. And Margaret Dennis has spoken widely on this, and really what they're saying is that it's going to need a lot of work. You've got to have some transformative leadership, and we have to have some very creative changes that heavily involve students. And I wanted to include this because it is quite controversial. If you look at the next slide, what Margaret Dennis is suggesting, this is a new administrative structure. She's proposing that we look at actually match for match. Wherever you have an administrator, you have a student that actually matches. So this ups the student representation on many governance committees, and even going to the point that you have governance by consensus rather than top-down directives. I think this is probably more controversial than even talking about the calendar, but anyway, I wanted to share because I think it's an interesting model for us to think about, and certainly a direction going. Next slide, please. The COVID forever legacies, and again, this is Margaret Dennis, and why she's calling for this radical forever university, you know, talking about fewer international students, fewer traditional students, thinking about alternative credentials, digital badges, that jobs in future are going to have more skills-based hiring practices rather than whether or not a student has a post-secondary degree. Projecting that 100 million projected job openings will not require a 4-year undergraduate degree. So it emphasizes the urgency that we're in here to make some changes. Next slide, please. Rise in student activism. Again, this is a concern for us. We have the COVID warriors who wanted reduced tuition, removal of fees, stricter or less enforcement of physical distancing protocols, closed campus, open campus. And then now a lot of activism in housing, food security, the financial crisis. I think the pandemic has really helped students to have a voice. And I think in the continued uncertainty that we have, transparent communication and collaborative partnership models, I think will help. I mean, I think it's great that students are activists and do share their concerns, but I do think partnership models will help us move forward on this. So as we move forward, next slide, just a couple more as we finish. There are some challenges in the students as partner models. Time constraints, it takes a while to establish partnerships. Large class sizes are problematic for some departments. Student resistance, you know, why I'm paying tuition, why are you expecting me to do the work, that sort of thing. Staff skepticism, of course, this is, well, who's flying the plane type of argument. And then there are also many models in these student partnership models and different conceptualizations as an emerging field. Full partnership might always be possible or desirable, but I think meaningful partnership requires a high level of equality and contributions from our partners. So I think we just have to start and see where this goes. Next slide. And then just the final thoughts are, you know, COVID's brought many challenges to us, some silver linings, but if we only seek short term, then the future is going to be in jeopardy. And a really nice phrase from Dr. Riker Newton, just place students at the heart of our processes and acknowledge them as human beings. That's what student centricity is about. And we want to create new forms of belonging to ensure students want a post-secondary degree. They want to align with that institution. And I think by doing the radical overhaul to student-centric institutions who see the value of students as partners will be a great way forward. And I mentioned at the beginning that I read about the University of Alberta initiative this morning, and they have just a new student action on experience, and the motions going through jointly submitted by the student associations and the institution And we should really look at it. I think it really is very exciting. It's a nice example of something that we need to do. So that's it, everyone. And I think there was one last slide just saying thank you. I hope you found it useful and made you think about some things. And we have a little bit of time, I think, for questions, Kathleen. Or sharing, even better.
Yes, and if you'd like to raise your hand, I can also unmute you to allow you to speak. I feel quite in control here. It's a strange system, but some comments. I'm sure everyone's doing very interesting things at their respective schools.
So we've got somebody raised their hand there, Serene.
Yes, hi. Hi, thank you. I just want to say thank you for this presentation. It is so thought-provoking, not only for me as an educational professional, but as a consumer of higher ed and as a parent of children in higher ed. I'm just blown away by what you presented. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Serene. Thank you.
Others? If you'd like to also put your questions in the chat, happy to do that too, or in your Q&A. Oh, Allison Allen, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for a really great talk. I'm a department chair at the University of Western Ontario, and I wondered if you had any experience, either yourself in your institution or in your literature, about the role of community engaged learning and how that has helped / changed student engagement, because we've had some really great experiences at Western with that.
Yeah, I think the community engaged learning is it sort of emphasizes this shift, I think, in the more traditional post-secondary education, and I think working with the wider community and community engaged learning, and then that even that continuing into work integrated learning is, I think, so interesting, and I think it really picks up on some of the things that we talked about, because it gives the students agency as well as contributing to the wider community. So I think it really emphasizes those student-centric models by giving them that agency, and I you know, I do know your institution and the great work that you're doing in this field, and I know many do look to you for that community engaged learning. And again, you know, the terminology is so important, and I think as we move to more students as partner models, we might shift in the vocabulary that we use. And I know I get quite tongue-tied with all the work integrated learning stuff and the relationship with community engaged learning. And sometimes I think whilst we will see a shift in vocabulary, we sometimes get bogged down in that vocabulary, because what actually matters is the student experience. And I think they just learn so much in those community-based environments. Thank you.
Susan, we have a question from Rachel Mall, Vancouver Island University. I'm wondering about how student partnership models cope with the high turnover rate, as students are only with us for 1 to 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point, and it is a disadvantage of these models. But we need to build in this right from the very beginning, with as students enter into their first years. And of course, it's quite challenging, as they often lack the confidence to engage in these partnership type experiences. So yeah, I think we just have to do our best to see how right at the outset we can instill and change the culture that this is how the institution operates. You're valued, your voice matters, not just from a survey perspective, but actually from, working with us to make changes. So yeah, partnership models, not for everybody, but we will find some students who will take it right from the first year and be involved right to the fourth year, and perhaps some will not engage at all in partnership models. But it is a challenge. Thank you for the question.
Okay, I don't see any other. I wondered if I might follow up, Susan, and ask you a question, because I've spent quite a bit of time at a university that we often found students went to schools, professional schools, after their first year or second year. How do you think that works when the student then enters another institution later in their degree? Do you think that it's easy to bring them into a student partnership model when they have a history at a different institution? And I think that's probably, sort of manifested as we find students perhaps move around more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I from a lot of the reading that I've done, I think we are going to see higher student mobility and transferability, not just within provinces, but across the country. And I think actually moving institutions and having those diversity of experiences can actually be really very helpful, both to the student and also the institution, with regard to, sharing those experiences and using a critical eye and using their voice. So transferability, I think was probably a little more skeptical to start with when I moved from England to Canada. It's typically not something that happens in England widely, but in Canada it's much more commonplace. I actually think it's very helpful for a lot of students.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions or comments. If anybody wishes to raise their hand, we have a couple more minutes. Otherwise, please feel free to. Oh, we have questions. Considering how slow change can be done, do you have comments or insights about implementing change based on the partnerships with current students as opposed to future students? Some of these changes may take 5 to 6 years. Will those future students still benefit? And that's from Céline Demont.
Yeah, again, it's a great question. I said a silver lining from COVID was that it showed that we can do things quickly, but I think, we are going to lapse a little. It's still going to take a while to get things going. I just feel that we can get going now on some very low key engagement with students. As I say, what I read about the University of Alberta this morning, well, they've actually gone in a big way. It's an institutional approach that they're using. But even if you started on something like food insecurity, that you worked with the student association, with students, and collectively looked at how each part of the institution, the administration and the student associations, could jointly come together to work on something that would help address food insecurity. So something pretty small like that. Absolutely, I think the passion is there from both sides, and some great things could come from that. So I would just start small with a small initiative, and really shout and sing about it, and as a model that could then be broadened across the institution. I think we are going to have skeptics on both sides, but honestly, I just don't think we have a choice. This is no longer an option for us. I do believe we really have to think about what we're here for as post-secondary institutions, and the partnership model absolutely makes sense from that, educating students and making us all better people.
Okay, we have no further questions, no chat, and I believe Sarin, did you have any further comment?
No, thank you. Just again, this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Oh, I noticed my hand was still up from 10 minutes ago. I apologize.
No
I'm
problem.
sorry. But thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Seeing no more questions, and we're just about at the top of the hour. This will be posted on the CHERD website, and of course, you'll see that there is an email for Susan. And if you think of questions as you get back to respective desks and institutions, please reach out to her. But thank you again, Susan, for a very thought-provoking and a very interesting presentation, something that's pretty important as we move forward. So thank you very much, and thanks all of you for your time today.